Why is it a big deal if we see the tax returns of the presidents or presidential candidates? Because in 1973, Richard Nixon was involved in a scandal regarding some questionable tax deductions, which could have led to his impeachment, if not for a larger Watergate scandal. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. Before we get into Nixon's tax story, let's look at the fascinating history of taxes in the United States. In 1862, the Bureau of Internal Revenue was created to help raise money for the Civil War. And in 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, officially granting the government the ability to collect taxes. Wait, did you fast forward through all that? I get it. Tax history, right? But here's the meat of the matter. Nixon donated his personal papers to the National Archives, and he deducted their appraised value from his taxes, $500,000, about $4 million today, despite a change in the tax code that he himself had signed. Since the time of George Washington, it was the norm that the papers of the president were considered the personal property of the president. Congress even endorsed this idea when they passed the Presidential Libraries Act of 1955. This loophole has since been closed with the amended Presidential Libraries Act of 1986. If anyone donates personal property to governmental or nonprofit institutions, that donation is tax deductible. And former Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, and even former Vice President and President-elect Richard Nixon all took advantage of this tax break. In 1967, the Washington Post published an article that 155 individuals making over $200,000 paid absolutely no taxes. This led to media and public outrage that something must be done, and so the Tax Reform Act of 1969 was signed into law by President Nixon, even though it was going to impact him personally. For you see, in that new law, the deduction of personal papers was limited to the cost of the paper itself, not the appraised value of their content. This change was to take effect for donations after July 25th, 1969. So if Nixon wanted to take advantage of this deduction one last time, he'd better move fast. So on March 27th, 1969, Nixon donated 1,176 boxes of his papers to the United States and claimed a deduction of $500,000 on his 1969 tax returns. During a 1972 deposition for a civil damages suit around the Watergate break-in, Nixon's donation was referenced. This led Washington Post reporter Nick Kotz to question the timing of that donation. After some investigation, Kotz published 2 articles in June of 1973 with the limited information he had uncovered around the donation and the deduction. This was followed up with an article interviewing Nixon's personal tax attorney, Frank DeMarco Jr., which confirmed the key facts. Later that summer, another tax controversy erupted when the New York Times reported on questions over whether Nixon owed capital gains taxes on the sale of 23 acres from his San Clemente, California estate. In October 1973, Jack White, no, not that Jack White, investigative reporter Jack White of the Providence Journal-Bulletin received from an anonymous source copies of Nixon's 1970 and 1971 tax returns. They showed he paid an average of $835 in each of those years on an annual income of $200,000. This level of taxes was the equivalent of someone who made $7,000. By the way, Jack White won the Pulitzer Prize for this article. As the scandal gained momentum, Nixon tried to recreate the impact of the Checkers speech from 20 years earlier by holding another, televised speech to address the brewing political storm. For reference, the Checkers speech was delivered in 1952 while Nixon was running as Eisenhower's vice president. Nixon was accused of improper use of money from a political fund he had set up. In the speech, he said there was one gift he would not return, a Cocker Spaniel his kids had named Checkers, hence the name of the speech. Thanks to that speech, Nixon weathered the storm, remained on the ticket, and was elected vice president under Eisenhower. On November 17, 1973, at Disney World in Orlando, Florida, Nixon addressed a group of 400 newspaper editors and delivered one of his most memorable quotes, often misattributed to the Watergate scandal.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Nailed it. Although, after 3 weeks, the scandal was still gaining momentum. So Nixon had to do something extraordinary. Nixon agreed to provide copies of his tax returns to the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, also known as the JCT, and asked them to review the gift of his official papers to the National Archives and the sale of property at his San Clemente estate, quote, in order to resolve these questions to the full satisfaction of the American people. He agreed to abide by their findings and pay any underreported taxes and interest. The JCT thought that might create a distorted view, so they decided to review everything. And they were not the only ones. The Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service at the time, Donald Alexander, heard the "I'm not a crook" press conference and was moved to conduct his own investigation, despite the public's perception that the IRS could not be impartial since they reported to the White House. On November 28th, before the JCT started their audit, Alexander told his boss, Secretary of the Treasury George Shultz, that he was going to open an audit of Nixon's returns. After 4 months and 30 interviews, the JCT produced a 1,000-page report that found a dozen problems with Nixon's returns. Some minor, but a few were significant, relating to the gifts of his papers, the sale of his San Clemente property, and the sale of his New York apartment. The largest issue was with the $500,000 gift of his personal papers. Even though he gave these papers to the National Archives before the July 25, 1969 deadline, he did not fill out the proper paperwork, a deed transferring ownership. The deed that was submitted over a year later was not even signed by Nixon, but by the president's deputy counsel, and there is no evidence that he had the authorization to sign that document. The bottom line, according to the JCT, was that Nixon owed $475,000 for unpaid taxes over 4 years and the associated interest. This is equal to about $3.2 million today and represented about half of Nixon's net worth. The IRS findings were similar at just over $430,000. It is unclear if Nixon ever paid this money. Within 4 months, the Watergate scandal forced Nixon to resign. And a month after that, President Ford granted a full and unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes that he might have committed against the United States as president, which would have included any unpaid federal taxes. This breach of public trust was serious enough that during the Watergate hearings, articles of impeachment for tax fraud were considered, although ultimately rejected. Yet another aspect of Nixon's presidency remains. In order to build trust with the U.S. electorate, presidential candidates usually share their tax returns voluntarily. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please click the like button and subscribe to hear more presidential stories. And please visit POTUS.com to learn more interesting facts about the presidents.